The Yakovlev III was a single-engine, single-seat Soviet fighter. Development of the Yak-3 began as early as 1941. The Soviet Union needed a fighter that could match the latest Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf models, and so the decision was to base the design on the Yak-1 that had been one of the most successful fighters of the Soviet Air Force. The mastermind behind the project was Alexander Yakovlev, a leading Soviet engineer who by age 28 was already the director of the biggest Soviet aircraft factory. He was tasked by Joseph Stalin himself with the creation of a fighter that would rival those of the Luftwaffe. This meant that the older Yak-1 model had to be upgraded in three main points: a more powerful engine, smaller size, and better armament. The first Yak-3 reached the front lines in 1944, and the first regiment to field it was the 91st, belonging to the 2nd Air Army under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Kovalyov. The baptism of fire came on the Lviv-Sandomir offensive, part of the Soviet attempt to free Ukraine. Soon, the 91st Regiment found that they had received a new highly agile fighter that had consistent firepower. The operation was a surprising success, in part thanks to the Yak-3. The Soviet army was able to expel the Wehrmacht from Ukraine and parts of Poland. The 91st Regiment flew 431 missions from the 13th of July to the 29th of August 1944, with the Yak-3 shooting down 20 German fighters and 3 bombers, losing only 2 of their own number. After its initial success, the German Air Force recognized the threat that the new aircraft posed by issuing a general order not to dogfight the Yak-3 below the altitude of 5,000 meters. The Yak-3 contributed actively to wrestle air control over the Eastern Front from the grasp of the Luftwaffe and supported the Red Army in the fight for Ukraine, Belarus and Poland and the final advance into Germany. Its main purpose was to escort Ilshin-2 and Petliakov-2 bombers where Yak-3 formations would fly in advance and strafe German air bases with considerable success. Its simpler construction and smaller size, in comparison to the fighters of other nations, didn't impact its performance. Despite an inadequate maintenance and harsh operating conditions, the Yak-3 kept going and outperforming its rivals. In addition to the considerable success in the Soviet Air Force, the Yak-3 was also used triumphantly by the Normandy Niemen, a unit composed only of French pilots sent by Charles de Gaulle to support the Soviet Union. The French group achieved at least 99 of their 273 victories with the new airplane after switching from the older Yak-9. The combined production of Yak-1, 3, 7 and 9 reached 37,000 units, demonstrating the importance it held for the Soviet Union. The Yak-3 model had a total production of 4,848 units, although it was only available late in the war. Among its qualities, the Yak-3 had an excellent maneuverability and could do a 360 turn in about 17 seconds at lower altitudes. This was considerably faster than the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. It had a very low weight and excellent climb rates. During the war, General Walter Schwabediesen, commander of the Luftwaffe in Denmark, said that no German plane could outclimb the Yak-3. It also used simple and inexpensive materials, which was in line with most Soviet weapons in the World War II. The Yak-3 was simple but rugged. The Yak-3 had some vulnerabilities, and some of its qualities also had a drawback. The small weight also meant it could take less fuel and consequently had a small combat range of about 550 kilometers or 297 nautical miles. This meant that it had to be used on frontline airfields. Although it had a burst mass of 2.72 kilograms per second, the Yak-3 had an inadequate armament to fire against armored ground targets or heavier bombers. It was also mainly tailored towards low-altitude flight. The Yak-3 lacked performance at higher altitude levels. Several experiments were made, mostly modifying the main version's armament with heavier cannons or introducing more powerful engines with better performances at higher altitude. Most variants didn't make it past prototype, and during the war no other version saw consistent frontline duty. The Yak-3 was a small-sized fighter with a length of 8.5 meters, height of 2.39 meters and a wingspan of 9.2 meters. It had a light frame tailored to high performance at a low altitude. The wings and tail were made of wood with plywood and fabric coverings. The short span of only 9.2 meters gave agility that was only matched by the Japanese A6M0 early war variants. The fuselage was of chrome molybdenum steel tube with dural coverings in the front portion and plywood fabric in the back. The undercarriage was fully retractable, including tailwheel. Tough construction meant it could be easily used on the rough, ill-prepared runways of the Eastern Front. The oil cooler air intake was in the wing hood. This was a drastic change from the other Yak models that had a large undernose intake. This feature was used by Luftwaffe pilots to distinguish the Yak 3 from other Yak models. The windshield was one piece and allowed for more visibility in comparison to other Yak models. It was armored and provided extra protection to the pilot. The cockpit was simple with a lack of gyroscopic instruments. This meant that the airplane was highly restricted by poor weather conditions. The Yak 3 was armed with two 12.7mm Berezin UBS machine guns. It also featured a 20mm SH VAK cannon that fired through the nose barrel. The main variant had a Klimov VK105 PF2 engine that could develop about 1,300 horsepower with a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. The Messerschmitt Bf109 G6 was the German equivalent when the Yak 3 reached the front lines. Let's see how the Soviet plane fared head-to-head with one of the most famous fighters in history. The Yak 3 was considerably more maneuverable than the Bf109 both in turn rate and roll rate, especially at lower altitudes. The Messerschmitt had a much more powerful engine with over 100 horsepower more than the Soviet. The Soviet plane was faster at lower altitudes due to its low weight and aerodynamic shape. Both planes had very similar combat ranges. The German plane had a much higher service ceiling and much better behavior at higher altitudes. The Soviet airplane had dual 12.7mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon. The German aircraft had two 13mm machine guns, dual wing-mounted 20mm cannons, and either a 20mm or 30mm cannon firing through the spin. Some units of the Bf109G didn't have the wing-mounted cannons, but still that was the most common configuration and it made the German plane have a much more lethal firepower. The Yak 3 was superior to the Bf109 G6 in low-altitude dogfights thanks to its agility, but above 5,000 meters the German fighter was superior in almost every way. Rating the Yakovlev 3. June 1944, 18 Yak 3 fought 24 German planes. The Soviets traded one plane and had another damage for 15 Germans shot down. 17 July 1944, 8 Yak 3 intercepted a formation of 60 German aircraft including escort fighters. The Luftwaffe lost 3 Junkers 87 and 4 Bf-109G. The Soviets took no losses. Alexander Ivanovich Koldunov was the biggest ace operating Yakovlev fighters. He attained 46 victories aboard the Yakovlev 1, 9 and 3. In a curious note, 3 of those victories were achieved against American P-38 Lightning. This happened during the air battle over Nice, a friendly fire event where American pilots engaged wrongly Soviet ground forces. Koldunov would reach the rank of Chief Marshal of Aviation, the highest rank in the Soviet Air Force. He was also nominated twice Hero of the Soviet Union. Marcel Albert was a French pilot that joined the Normandy Niemen in 1942, a unit of French pilots that fought the Germans on the Eastern Front. He started flying Yak 1 and 9 aircraft and later the Yak 3. He achieved a total of 23 victories, 15 of them shared, and 7 of them with the Yak 3. Marcel was of the opinion that the Yak 3 was better than the British Supermarine Spitfire and the American P-51 Mustang. He was the second highest scoring French pilot of the war and was nominated Hero of the Soviet Union, something very rare for a non-Soviet. Regardless of its faults, the Yak 3 was what the Soviet Union needed. It filled the role of low-altitude air superiority fighter with astounding results. Some of the initial engagements that were very favorable to the Yak 3 can be explained partially by the surprise factor, as most probably the German Air Force took some time to adapt to this new threat. Also, we always have to consider that some of the statistics might be exaggerated by propaganda and the pilots themselves. Still, there is no denying that the Yak-3 made its mark on the Eastern Front and undoubtedly helped the Soviet Union win the war. Some sources state that the Yak-3 was considered the best Soviet fighter of the Second World War. But there are other candidates. And the common discussion in the Soviet Air Force was which manufacturer produced the best Soviet fighter, with MiG and Lavochkin pilots favoring their own machines over the Yaks. We may never know how this aircraft would have fared against the much more organized German Air Force of years prior, but we can all agree that it was a very graceful machine. Thank you very much for watching. Please consider leaving a like, subscribing and hitting the notification button. It would help me a lot. Also feel free to tell me what can be done better in the comments below. I'll see you on the next video.